Look what the Navy dragged in. A wannabe sniper with pretty blue hair thinks she can hang with the real warriors. Kane Morrison's voice boomed across the morning mess hall like thunder before a storm. The 6'4" mountain of muscle in desert camo didn't just speak. He commanded attention with the kind of presence that made recruits step aside and officers take notice. His massive hand connected with Evelyn's shoulder, sending her stumbling forward. The metal tray exploded against the concrete floor, scrambled eggs and burnt toast scattering like shrapnel across the polished surface. The sound echoed through the cavernous space, sharp and violent as a gunshot. Evelyn Raven Lawson barely caught herself, her worn brown combat boots scraping for purchase against the unforgiving floor. Athletic and toned beneath her deep V-neck military green t-shirt, her porcelain skin seemed to glow against the stark morning light, filtering through the mess hall's industrial windows. Her long neon blue hair caught every eye, an impossibility in this world of regulation cuts and military conformity. But it was her silence that unnerved them most. No tears, no protests, just those gray-blue eyes scanning the room with the kind of calm that came from seeing worse things than a cafeteria full of laughing seals. The laughter erupted like a dam breaking. 37 trainees, instructors, and support staff turned their attention to the spectacle, phones appearing with predatory speed. Here was their morning entertainment. A woman who looked like she'd wandered off a comic convention straight into the most elite military training facility in America. Seriously, who approved cosplay Barbie for sniper training? Staff Sergeant Lisa Hayes cackled, her perfect blonde ponytail bouncing as she gestured at Evelyn's unconventional appearance. Her voice carried the particular cruelty that only came from someone desperate to prove their own belonging by highlighting another's otherness. I mean, what's next? Letting influencers run black ops? The crowd pressed closer, forming a tight semicircle around the spectacle. Morrison had orchestrated this moment perfectly, choosing the busiest time of the morning shift change to maximize his audience. The acoustics of the mess hall amplified every word, every snicker, every whispered comment into a symphony of humiliation. Morrison stepped closer, his polished boots clicking against the floor with military precision. Everything about him screamed authority, from his perfectly pressed uniform to the way other trainees unconsciously moved aside when he passed. At 28, he'd earned his position through a combination of natural talent, relentless ambition, and the kind of charisma that made superior officers remember his name during promotion reviews. "You know what really gets me?" Morrison announced, stopping directly in front of Evelyn and leaning down until his face was inches from hers. The crowd fell silent, sensing the escalation. It's not just the fake credentials. It's not even the stolen valor wannabe energy. It's the sheer arrogance of thinking you could fool actual warriors. Evelyn's response was to slowly bend down and begin collecting the scattered food from her tray. Her movements were deliberate, economical, each gesture containing a precision that spoke of muscle memory drilled beyond conscious thought. She didn't hurry, didn't appear flustered. If anything, her calm seemed to amplify the chaos around her. "Look at this," Hayes continued, emboldened by Morrison's lead and the crowd's attention. "Princess Pretty Hair thinks she's too good to even acknowledge real soldiers. Probably never held anything heavier than a makeup brush." Private Billy Santos shifted uncomfortably near the edge of the crowd. Fresh out of basic training and still intimidated by everything that moved, he'd developed a nervous habit of recording interesting moments on his phone. Something about the way Evelyn held herself, spine straight despite the humiliation, nagged at him. The way she moved, there was something there. Something that didn't match the civilian contractor story everyone had been told. Master Chief Thomas Kane stood at the serving line, his weathered face impassive as he observed the scene. With 32 years of service etched into every line around his eyes, Kane had developed an instinct for reading people that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments and countless training exercises that could have ended badly. The woman, Lawson, according to her paperwork, moved wrong for a civilian. Too controlled, too aware of her surroundings. Morrison reached down and knocked the half-filled tray from Evelyn's hands again, sending eggs sliding across the floor in a yellow smear. "I'm talking to you, Barbie. Show some respect when a superior addresses you. I heard you, Evelyn said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly through the mess hall. I just don't see anything worth responding to. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's face flushed red, his jaw working as he processed what felt like the most direct challenge to his authority he'd faced since arriving at Coronado. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing blood in the water. Excuse me? Morrison's voice had gone dangerously soft. Did you just... I said what I said. Evelyn straightened slowly, her gray-blue eyes meeting his without flinching. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other across a gulf of assumptions and misunderstandings that would define everything that followed. Then Evelyn turned and walked away, leaving Morrison standing among the scattered food with his authority challenged and his audience watching for his response. Her boot prints tracked egg and toast crumbs across the pristine floor, marking her path like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale written by someone with a cruel sense of humor. The walk to the equipment cage should have taken 3 minutes. Evelyn made it in 2.5, her pace steady and unhurried despite the whispers that followed her like smoke. The morning sun slanted through the windows of Building 7, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. Weapon racks lined the walls, each rifle secured with regulation locks and tagged with inventory numbers that spoke of bureaucracy and accountability. Armorer First Class Rodriguez looked up from his clipboard as she approached, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed amusement. Word traveled fast in a facility this size, and the mess hall incident had already made its way through unofficial channels. Miss Lawson, Rodriguez said, his tone carefully neutral. Here for your weapon assignment? That's the plan, Evelyn replied, scanning the available rifles with the kind of systematic attention that made Rodriguez's eyebrows rise slightly. She moved along the rack like she was reading a menu, pausing at each weapon for exactly the same amount of time. Most of our civilian contractors prefer the newer models, Rodriguez offered, gesturing toward a row of pristine M24s that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Better optics, improved accuracy, more forgiving trigger systems. Evelyn's hand stopped at a rifle that looked like it had seen better decades. The M40A3 was older than most of the trainees, its wooden stock bearing the dings and scratches of countless training exercises. The scope was an ancient unertal that belonged in a museum, and the trigger guard showed wear patterns that spoke of thousands of rounds fired. As she reached up to lift the rifle from its rack, her deep V-neck shirt shifted with the movement. For just a moment, less than 2 seconds, the fabric pulled away from her chest, revealing a glimpse of black ink beneath. The curved edge of what looked like a skull's outline, dark against her pale skin, before she straightened and the shirt fell back into place. Her hand moved instinctively to adjust her collar, a gesture so quick and natural it might have been unconscious. Rodriguez was focused on his clipboard, making notes about equipment assignments, and didn't notice the brief exposure. But the image lingered, that flash of black ink that suggested stories hidden beneath civilian clothes. This one, she said, lifting the rifle with movements that were almost reverent. Rodriguez blinked. Ma'am, that weapon is... well, it's scheduled for retirement. The accuracy standards don't meet current specifications. And this one, Evelyn repeated, checking the action with the fluid motions of someone who'd performed the same inspections so many times it had become automatic. The bolt slid forward with a satisfying click, the sound crisp despite the weapon's age. From the doorway, a familiar voice cut through the morning air. Well, 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 look what we have here. Morrison had followed her, bringing with him an entourage of 6 trainees who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but had been swept along by the force of his personality. Hayes brought up the rear, her expression suggesting she smelled something unpleasant. Rodriguez, tell me you're not actually issuing equipment to Toy Story Barbie here, Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that made junior personnel nervous. I mean, that thing's older than she is. Probably weighs more than she does, too. Evelyn continued her inspection, running her finger along the barrel's exterior with the kind of familiarity that made Rodriguez's professional instincts start sending warning signals. The way she handled the weapon, The unconscious competence in her movements. The fact that she'd chosen the one rifle in the rack that would require genuine skill to shoot accurately. It all added up to something that didn't fit the narrative everyone had constructed around her. Actually, Hayes chimed in, maybe it's perfect. Give the wannabe the broken-down rifle. When she can't hit anything, we'll have proof she doesn't belong here. The comment triggered a round of snickers from Morrison's followers, but Rodriguez noticed something else. The woman hadn't reacted to the insults at all. She'd gone completely still, her attention focused on the rifle in her hands with the kind of intensity that made him think of professional shooters he'd worked with over the years. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "are you sure about that weapon?" Evelyn looked up, and for just a moment Rodriguez caught something in her eyes that made him think of his brother, who'd done 3 tours with recon Marines and had the same look when he talked about equipment that had saved his life. "This rifle has character," she said simply. "I respect that." Morrison stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over the equipment cage. "Character? That's what we're calling junk now? Lady, that thing couldn't hit a barn if you were standing inside it." "Maybe," Evelyn said, slinging the rifle across her shoulder with practiced ease. "I guess we'll find out." The walk to the range compound took them past the administrative building, where Commander Sarah Blackstone watched from her office window. Blackstone had been running background checks on civilian contractors for 7 years, and something about Evelyn Lawson's paperwork bothered her. Not what was there. Everything checked out perfectly. Too perfect. Like someone had taken great care to construct an identity that would pass casual inspection while hiding deeper truths. The range itself sprawled across 200 acres of carefully maintained shooting lanes, each one stretching from covered firing positions to targets placed at distances ranging from 50 to 1,000 yards. The morning air carried the familiar scents of gun oil, cordite, and the peculiar metallic smell that clung to places where thousands of rounds had been fired over the years. Range Safety Officer Lieutenant Pierce stood at the control booth, his weathered face impassive as he watched the morning's first group of trainees take their positions. Pierce had been running ranges for 15 years, and he'd developed the ability to spot trouble before it started. The group approaching his range had trouble written all over it. Morrison's voice carried across the concrete as he continued his running commentary. "This should be good. $20 says Barbie here can't even figure out which end the bullet comes out of. If you're feeling that burn of injustice watching Evelyn endure this humiliation, smash that like button right now because justice is coming hard. We post verified military stories honoring silent warriors every week. Ring the bell so you never miss these moments of triumph. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments." Hayes laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. $20? I'll take that action. But I'm betting she doesn't even make it through the safety briefing without crying. Pierce's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "Range is hot. All personnel behind the firing line. Safety equipment is mandatory." His tone brooked no argument, carrying the authority of someone who'd seen training accidents and had no intention of explaining to superior officers why someone got hurt on his watch. Evelyn moved to firing position 7, the lane that offered the clearest view of the 1,000-yard targets. She set up her equipment with methodical precision, arranging everything within easy reach. The worn bipod extended with a soft click, the sandbags positioned to provide maximum stability. Every movement spoke of repetition, of habits formed through countless hours of practice. "Lane 7, Pierce announced through the range speakers. "You're cleared for a 10-round familiarization course. Targets at 200 yards. Begin when ready." Evelyn settled behind the rifle, her body falling into a shooting position that looked textbook perfect to anyone who knew what they were looking at. But instead of the natural, comfortable stance it appeared to be, every angle had been carefully calculated to hide her true capabilities. Her breathing pattern, the way she gripped the rifle, even the position of her support hand, all of it designed to suggest competence without revealing expertise. The first shot echoed across the range, sharp and clean. Through his spotting scope, Pierce watched the bullet impact 3 inches left of center. A respectable shot for a civilian contractor, exactly what the paperwork suggested she should be capable of. The second shot struck 4 inches right, 2 inches high. Still within acceptable parameters, but showing the kind of inconsistency that marked someone learning to handle an unfamiliar weapon. Morrison's voice carried from the observation area. "See? I told you. Can't even keep them on the paper consistently. This is what happens when you let civilians play soldier." But Pierce was studying the pattern through his scope, and something bothered him. The shots weren't random misses. They formed a precise pattern around the target's center, each one exactly the same distance from the bullseye. That kind of consistency took skill to achieve, whether you were hitting or missing. Shot 3 struck low left. Shot 4, high right. Each impact formed another point in what was becoming an unmistakable pattern. A perfect circle around the target's center, each bullet placed with mathematical precision. In the observation booth, Kane set down his coffee and picked up his own spotting scope. 32 years of experience had taught him to recognize when something didn't add up, and what he was seeing through the scope made no sense. Nobody missed that precisely by accident. Evelyn's 5th shot completed the pattern, striking exactly where geometry dictated it should to maintain the perfect circle. She worked the bolt with smooth efficiency, ejecting the spent brass in a gleaming arc that caught the morning sunlight. 5 more rounds, Pierce announced, though his voice carried a note of curiosity that hadn't been there before. Same target, same distance. The second string of shots produced an identical pattern. 5 bullets placed in a perfect circle around the target's center, each one exactly the same distance from the bullseye as its corresponding shot in the first string. The precision required to achieve such consistency while appearing to miss was staggering. Morrison's laughter died in his throat as he borrowed Pierce's scope and saw the pattern for himself. "What the hell?" Kane stepped up to the firing line, his weathered face thoughtful. "Miss Lawson," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that came with 3 decades of military service. Interesting grouping. Evelyn looked up from where she was checking her rifle's action, her expression carefully neutral. "Problems with the scope alignment," she said. "Old equipment, you know how it is." "Scope problems," Kane repeated, his tone suggesting he wasn't buying the explanation. "Funny thing about scope problems, they usually produce random patterns. What you just shot wasn't random." The range fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway beyond the base perimeter. Other shooters in nearby lanes had stopped their own exercises to watch the drama unfolding at position 7. "Maybe I'm just consistently bad," Evelyn said with a slight shrug. "Some people have a gift for missing." Kane studied her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that others missed. The way she held herself, the unconscious competence in her handling of the weapon, the fact that she'd chosen the most difficult rifle on the rack and was shooting it like she'd been born with it in her hands. "Maybe," Kane said finally, "or maybe you're the most accurate poor shot I've ever seen." Hayes stepped forward, her voice sharp with frustration. "What's that supposed to mean? She missed every shot." "Did she?" Kane asked, his gaze never leaving Evelyn's face. "Or did she hit exactly what she was aiming for?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the rifle barrels, heavy with implications that no one wanted to examine too closely. Evelyn stood slowly, slinging the old rifle across her shoulder with the same practiced ease she'd shown in the equipment cage. "I should probably head to admin," she said quietly. "Fill out some paperwork about the scope issue." As she walked away, her boot prints left barely visible marks in the dust of the firing line. Behind her, Kane continued to study the target through his scope, counting bullet holes and measuring distances with the methodical attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Morrison cleared his throat, his earlier confidence shaken by what he'd witnessed. So what if she can miss in a pattern, still can't hit what she's supposed to hit? But Kane wasn't listening. He was thinking about the kind of training it would take to develop that level of control, the mindset required to deliberately miss with such precision. In his experience, only one type of person learned to shoot like that, someone who needed to hide their true capabilities while maintaining the ability to perform when it mattered. The administrative building hummed with the quiet efficiency of military bureaucracy. Evelyn's soft-soled boots made no sound on the polished linoleum as she navigated corridors lined with motivational posters and official photographs of distinguished graduates. The familiar smell of copy toner and industrial coffee hung in the air, mixing with the faint traces of gun oil that clung to her clothing. Room 107 housed the equipment maintenance office, where Corporal Janet Martinez spent her days tracking the life cycle of everything from rifle scopes to helicopter engines. Martinez looked up from her computer screen as Evelyn knocked on the doorframe, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to mild surprise. "Miss Lawson? Wasn't expecting to see you until next week's scheduled maintenance cycle. Having some issues with the scope on my assigned rifle," Evelyn said, settling into the chair across from Martinez's desk. "Accuracy problems that might be equipment-related." Martinez pulled up the relevant files on her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. "Serial number?" Evelyn rattled off the numbers without consulting any paperwork, her recall perfect and immediate. Martinez's eyebrows rose slightly. Most people needed to check their equipment tags for that information. "Ah," Martinez said, her tone shifting to one of understanding. "The old M40A3. Yeah, that scope's been flagged for replacement for, let me see, 8 months now. Budget constraints, you know how it is." As Martinez typed notes into her system, Evelyn's eyes wandered to the computer screen. What she saw there made her pulse quicken slightly, though her expression remained carefully neutral. The maintenance database was using a security protocol she recognized, one typically reserved for facilities handling classified equipment. "Mind if I ask?" Evelyn said casually. "What system you're running there? Looks more sophisticated than standard inventory management." Martinez glanced at her screen, then back at Evelyn. "Oh, this? It's the new integrated logistics system. Tracks everything from procurement to disposal. Pretty slick, actually." She paused, studying Evelyn's face. "You familiar with logistics software?" "Gaming," Evelyn said with a slight smile. "I spend too much time playing military simulation games. Some of the interfaces look similar." The explanation seemed to satisfy Martinez, who turned back to her screen with renewed focus. But Evelyn had seen what she needed to see. The system architecture, the security protocols, the way information was structured and accessed. The pieces of a larger puzzle were starting to fall into place. 20 minutes later, Evelyn emerged from the administrative building with a work order for scope replacement and a head full of information that didn't belong to a civilian contractor. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the training facility's network of buildings and obstacle courses. Her next stop was the equipment storage facility, a massive warehouse where everything from uniforms to communications gear was sorted, maintained, and distributed. The building's climate control system hummed quietly, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity levels required to preserve sensitive electronics and optical equipment. Evelyn checked the encrypted communication device, the same military-grade technology special ops teams rely on in hostile territories. Advanced biometric security and satellite connectivity enable critical mission success even in complete radio blackout zones. Ruggedized screens withstand extreme battlefield conditions that destroy civilian electronics. In life-or-death situations, this tactical communication gear means the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Senior Chief Ramirez supervised the equipment inspection with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen what happened when gear failed at critical moments. His weathered hands moved over each piece of equipment, checking connections, testing functions, ensuring that everything met the exacting standards required for operations where failure wasn't an option. "New contractor?" Ramirez asked, as Evelyn approached the inspection station. His tone was professional but curious. Civilian contractors weren't usually assigned to handle sensitive equipment. "Evelyn Lawson," she replied, producing her credentials. "I'm supposed to be familiarizing myself with communications protocols." Ramirez studied her paperwork, then handed her a tactical radio that looked like it had survived several small wars. "Standard field radio," he explained. "Frequency hopping, encrypted transmission. Range of about 15 clicks in ideal conditions. Think you can handle it?" Evelyn turned the radio over in her hands, her fingers finding the controls with unconscious familiarity. She powered it on, cycled through the frequency settings, and performed a quick systems check with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd done it thousands of times before. "Seems straightforward," she said, though Ramirez caught the slight tremor in her voice as she handled equipment that clearly triggered some kind of emotional response. "You okay?" Ramirez asked, his tone gentler than before. "You look like you've seen a ghost." For a moment, Evelyn's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. The radio in her hands was identical to the one she'd used during her last operation, the one that had crackled with desperate voices as everything went wrong in the mountains of Afghanistan. She could almost hear the static, the urgent calls for backup that would never come. "Just brings back memories," she said quietly, setting the radio down with excessive care. "I had a brother who served. These things always remind me of him." The lie came easily, polished smooth by repetition and necessity. Ramirez nodded understanding. Half the people who worked at the facility had military connections, and equipment often triggered unexpected emotional responses. "Want to take a break?" Ramirez offered. "We can continue this tomorrow if you need." "No," Evelyn said, her voice steadying. "I'm fine. Let's keep going." The inspection continued for another hour, Evelyn demonstrating competence with communications equipment, navigation systems, and field electronics that impressed Ramirez despite his years of experience. She handled each piece of gear with the kind of confidence that spoke of extensive training, though she was careful to ask questions that maintained her cover as a civilian contractor learning new skills. By the time she left the equipment facility, word of her unusual morning was spreading through unofficial channels. The precise missing at the rifle range, her familiarity with military equipment, the way she moved and carried herself. It all added up to something that didn't quite fit the story everyone had been told. The mess hall was nearly empty when Evelyn returned for lunch, the morning's incident having cleared most of the usual crowd. She selected a corner table that offered clear sightlines to all entrances, a habit so ingrained she didn't consciously think about it anymore. Morrison found her there 20 minutes later, his approach announced by the deliberate clicking of his polished boots against the floor. He'd brought Hayes and 2 other trainees with him, their expressions suggesting this was more than a casual social visit. "Well, if it isn't Annie Oakley," Morrison said, sliding uninvited into the seat across from her. "Heard you put on quite a show at the range this morning." Evelyn continued eating her salad, her expression carefully neutral. "Just working on my accuracy issues." "Accuracy issues," Hayes repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Is that what we're calling it? Because what I heard was that you managed to miss every shot in exactly the same way. That takes talent." "Some people are gifted," Evelyn said quietly. "I'm gifted at missing." Morrison leaned forward, his presence imposing and clearly intended to intimidate. "You know what I think? I think you're playing games. I think you're hiding something, and I'm going to figure out what it is." The threat hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and menace. Around the mess hall, other diners had noticed the confrontation and were watching with the kind of fascinated attention that came with witnessing drama unfold in real time. "I'm not hiding anything," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. "I'm just a civilian contractor trying to do my job." "Right," Morrison said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word of it. "Just a regular civilian who happens to handle military equipment like she's been doing it for years. Just a regular civilian who can miss targets with mathematical precision." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "I'm watching you, Lawson. Every move, every mistake, every little thing that doesn't add up. And when I figure out what your game is, I'm going to make sure everyone knows about it." The group departed as suddenly as they'd arrived, leaving Evelyn alone with her salad and the weight of their suspicion. She continued eating with mechanical precision, but her mind was racing through contingencies and exit strategies. Across the facility, Master Chief Kane was having his own concerns. The afternoon briefing in Conference Room B brought together the senior staff responsible for training operations, and Kane's report about the morning's range session had generated more questions than answers. "So you're telling me," Commander Blackstone said, her tone carefully controlled, that this civilian contractor managed to place 10 rounds in 2 perfect circles around the target center, but couldn't actually hit the target itself? That's exactly what I'm telling you, Kane replied. And in 32 years of running ranges, I've never seen anything like it. The level of control required to miss that precisely. It's not something you learn by accident. Lieutenant Pierce nodded agreement from his position near the window. I've seen competitive shooters who couldn't maintain that kind of consistency. What she did this morning was either impossible luck or incredible skill disguised as incompetence. Blackstone made a note on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. Have we completed the background verification on Miss Lawson? Standard civilian screening came back clean, reported Administrative Officer Captain Williams. Previous employment history checks out, references are solid, no red flags in the security clearance process. Maybe too clean, Kane suggested. Sometimes the most suspicious thing about a background is when there's nothing suspicious about it. The comment triggered a moment of silence as the implications sank in. In a facility where paranoia was a survival trait and attention to detail could mean the difference between successful operations and catastrophic failures, Kane's instincts carried considerable weight. I want a deeper dive, Blackstone decided. Full background investigation, not just the standard contractor screening. If there's something to find, I want to know about it. As the meeting dispersed, Kane lingered in the corridor outside the conference room. Through the windows, he could see the range where Evelyn had performed her mysterious demonstration that morning. Something about the entire situation bothered him, like a puzzle piece that almost fit but not quite. The afternoon training session took place in the Simulation Center, a high-tech facility designed to replicate combat conditions without the risks associated with live ammunition. Evelyn arrived early, studying the layout with the systematic attention of someone cataloging potential exit routes and defensive positions. The scenario for the day involved communications coordination during a simulated rescue operation. Teams of trainees would be scattered across the facility's network of mock buildings and obstacle courses, maintaining contact through encrypted radio systems while navigating toward predetermined objectives. Morrison's team drew the primary assault position, a role that required coordinating the movements of multiple units while maintaining operational security. Hayes commanded the support element, responsible for providing cover and evacuation routes. Evelyn found herself assigned to communications coordination, a position that should have been safe, but would prove anything but. All right, people, announced Instructor Davis, a grizzled veteran whose calm demeanor masked decades of experience in situations where mistakes had permanent consequences. This is a full-scale exercise. You'll be evaluated on everything from tactical decision-making to equipment handling. Communications will be critical. If you can't talk to each other, people die. The exercise began with textbook precision. Morrison's team advanced on their objective while Hayes positioned her support elements to provide overwatch. Radio chatter filled the airwaves with position reports, status updates, and coordination requests that painted a picture of professional competence. Then everything went wrong. The scenario called for a wounded team member to require immediate medical attention, a complication designed to test the trainee's ability to adapt when plans encountered reality. But when Private Chen stumbled during the mock casualty evacuation, his fall was real, his cry of pain genuine as his ankle twisted beneath him. Evelyn's response was immediate and instinctive. She dropped her radio and moved toward Chen with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd dealt with combat injuries before. Her hands assessed the damage with professional competence, checking for signs of fracture while immobilizing the joint to prevent further injury. "It's not broken," she announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to making medical decisions under pressure. "Severe sprain. Probably some ligament damage. He needs ice and elevation, and we should get him to medical for x-rays." The transformation in her demeanor was striking. Gone was the uncertain civilian contractor who'd struggled with rifle accuracy that morning. In her place stood someone who moved with purpose, spoke with confidence, and demonstrated medical knowledge that went far beyond basic first aid. "How do you know all that?" Hayes demanded, her suspicion evident. "You're supposed to be communicating, not medical." Evelyn paused, realizing she'd revealed more than intended. "I took some emergency response courses. always seemed like useful knowledge to have, but the explanation rang hollow, particularly when contrasted with the professional competence she'd just displayed. Emergency response courses didn't teach the kind of rapid assessment and treatment techniques she'd demonstrated with Chen's injury. Your curiosity about Evelyn's hidden past is about to be rewarded in ways you never imagined. Subscribe now to witness the truth unfold. We bring authentic military revelations that challenge everything you think you know. Hit the bell to ensure you catch every shocking detail of this incredible story. Morrison appeared at her shoulder, his expression a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. Where exactly did you take these emergency response courses? Community college, Evelyn replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Part of a general fitness and safety program. The lie was getting harder to maintain, as evidence mounted that her skills went far beyond what any civilian training could provide. Around them, other trainees watched with growing curiosity as the mystery of Evelyn Lawson deepened. Davis called for a medical team to evaluate Chen's injury, and the exercise was suspended while proper treatment was arranged. As they waited for paramedics, conversation inevitably turned to Evelyn's unexpected medical competence. That was pretty impressive, admitted Rodriguez, one of Morrison's teammates. Most people would have panicked when they saw him go down like that. Some people just handle emergencies better than others, Evelyn said, but even she seemed to realize how inadequate the explanation sounded. Kane arrived as the paramedics were loading Chen into their ambulance, his weathered face thoughtful as he observed the scene. Heard there was some quick thinking that prevented a more serious injury, he said, his gaze finding Evelyn in the crowd. Just basic first aid, Evelyn replied, but Kane caught the slight tremor in her voice that suggested deeper currents running beneath the surface. Funny thing about first aid, Kane observed. Most people learn it from books and videos, but there's a difference between knowing what to do and knowing how to do it under pressure. What you showed today was the second kind. The comment landed with uncomfortable accuracy, highlighting the gap between Evelyn's supposed background and her demonstrated capabilities. Around them, the assembled trainees watched the exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a mystery unfold in real time. As the medical team departed with Chen, Davis called for the exercise to resume, but the dynamic had shifted, with Evelyn now occupying a position of reluctant attention that she clearly didn't want. The remainder of the afternoon passed without major incident, though Evelyn's every action was now subject to scrutiny from her fellow trainees. Her radio procedures were flawless, her coordination skills superior to most of the military personnel present, and her tactical awareness consistently impressed the instructors. By the time evening approached, word of her mysterious competence had spread throughout the facility. The woman who'd arrived as a civilian contractor with unusual hair and questionable credentials was beginning to resemble someone with extensive military training, who was trying very hard not to show it. The evening briefing in Conference Room C brought together the day's instructors and senior staff for their usual after-action review. Tonight, however, most of the discussion centered on a single topic: Evelyn Lawson, and the growing collection of inconsistencies surrounding her presence at the facility. The medical response was textbook perfect, Davis reported. She assessed the injury, applied appropriate treatment, and made correct decisions about follow-up care. That's not civilian first aid training. That's advanced combat medicine. Kane nodded agreement. Combined with this morning's shooting demonstration, we're looking at someone with skills that don't match her paperwork. Either she's the most naturally gifted civilian contractor we've ever seen, or she's something else entirely. Commander Blackstone listened to the reports with growing concern. Her own investigation into Evelyn's background had revealed exactly what everyone expected to find: a perfectly normal civilian contractor with appropriate credentials and clean references. But perfection itself was suspicious when contrasted with the very real skills being demonstrated. I want to accelerate the background investigation, Blackstone decided. Full military databases, not just civilian records. If she's former military, I want to know about it. Ma'am, Williams interjected, our civilian contractor protocols don't typically include military background checks unless there's specific cause for concern. Consider this specific cause, Blackstone replied. Someone with her skill set doesn't appear out of nowhere. Either she's exactly what she claims to be, and we're dealing with a remarkable coincidence, or she's hiding something that we need to know about. As the briefing concluded, Kane remained behind to study the day's reports. 32 years of military service had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was telling him that Evelyn Lawson represented something that didn't fit the normal patterns. The evening meal took place in a mess hall, buzzing with conversation about the day's events. Evelyn chose a table in the corner, hoping to avoid attention, but found herself the subject of curious glances and whispered discussions from every direction. Morrison approached with his usual entourage, but his demeanor had shifted from outright hostility to suspicious curiosity. "So, Lawson," he said, settling into the seat across from her without invitation. "Quite a day you've had." "Just doing my job," Evelyn replied, focusing on her meal with deliberate attention. "Right," Morrison said. "Your job, which apparently includes expert medical care, advanced radio procedures, and the ability to miss targets with mathematical precision. That's quite a skill set for a civilian contractor." Hayes leaned forward, her expression sharp with interest. "You know what I think? I think you're military, former military, trying to blend in with the civilians for some reason." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications that made everyone at the table uncomfortable. Evelyn continued eating, but her shoulders tensed slightly, betraying the first sign of stress she'd shown all day. "I'm not military," she said quietly. "Never have been." "Then explain today," Morrison demanded. "Explain how someone with no military background handles equipment like a professional, treats injuries like a combat medic, and shoots like, well, like someone who's been trained to shoot differently than the rest of us." The questions were fair, and Evelyn's answers were becoming increasingly inadequate. Around the mess hall, other diners had stopped their own conversations to listen to the confrontation unfolding at the corner table. "Some people are just naturally good at things," Evelyn said, but even she seemed to realize how weak the explanation sounded. "Natural talent," Hayes repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Is that your final answer?" Before Evelyn could respond, Kane appeared at their table, his presence immediately changing the dynamic of the conversation. "Miss Lawson," he said formally, "Commander Blackstone would like to see you in her office, if you would please." The summons carried the weight of official business, and Morrison's questions would have to wait. Evelyn rose from her seat, her movements careful and controlled despite the tension crackling through the air. "This conversation isn't over," Morrison called after her as she followed Kane toward the exit. "No," Kane agreed quietly. "I don't think it is." The walk to the administrative building took place in silence, both participants lost in their own thoughts. Kane's weathered face revealed nothing of his intentions, while Evelyn's expression had settled into the carefully neutral mask she'd worn throughout her time at the facility. Commander Blackstone's office occupied the corner of the second floor, its windows offering clear views of the training facilities where Evelyn had spent her mysterious day. The office itself reflected its occupant's personality, organized, efficient, and decorated with the kind of military memorabilia that spoke of a career built on attention to detail. "Miss Lawson," Blackstone said, gesturing toward the chair across from her desk. "Please, have a seat." Evelyn settled into the offered chair, her posture straight but relaxed, like someone accustomed to official interviews, but not particularly concerned about their outcome. Kane took position near the window, his role as observer clearly established. "I've been reviewing your file," Blackstone began, opening a folder that contained Evelyn's personnel records. "Everything appears to be in order. References check out. Qualifications are appropriate for your position. Security clearance processed without issues." "That's good to hear," Evelyn replied, her tone carefully neutral. "It is," Blackstone agreed. "But I'm curious about some of the skills you've demonstrated since arriving at our facility. The medical response today, for instance. Master Chief Kane tells me it was quite impressive." "I've had some first aid training," Evelyn said. "It seemed like the right thing to do when someone was hurt." Blackstone made a note on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "Your first aid training must have been quite comprehensive. The techniques you used aren't typically taught in civilian courses." The observation carried an implicit question, one that Evelyn answered with careful precision. "I've always been interested in emergency medicine. I've taken several courses over the years, some more advanced than others." The deployment paperwork beside Evelyn's gear included comprehensive coverage every operator maximizes before high-risk missions. Triple life insurance benefits protect families when standard policies fall short. 89% of Special Forces personnel increase their coverage before classified operations. Protecting your family's future matters as much as surviving today's mission when you're facing unknown dangers. "I see," Blackstone said, though her tone suggested she found the explanation insufficient. "And your radio procedures?" Master Chief Kane was quite impressed with your communications coordination. "Gaming," Evelyn replied with a slight smile. "I spend a lot of time playing military simulation games. Some of them are remarkably realistic." The explanation was the same one she'd offered before, polished smooth by repetition. But in the formal setting of Blackstone's office, it seemed even less convincing than it had earlier. "Gaming," Blackstone repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "That's interesting. Most games don't teach the kind of real-world applications you demonstrated today." Kane stepped forward from his position by the window, his weathered face serious. "Ma'am, there's something else. The shooting demonstration this morning. I've never seen anything like it." "Oh?" Blackstone's attention sharpened. "How so?" "She missed every shot," Kane explained, "but missed them with mathematical precision. Perfect circles around the target center, each bullet placed exactly where it needed to be to maintain the pattern. That level of control, it's not something you develop by accident." Blackstone turned her attention back to Evelyn, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. "Can you explain that level of consistency in your shooting?" "Old rifle," Evelyn said. "Scope problems. Sometimes equipment issues create predictable patterns." But Kane shook his head. "Ma'am, I've been running ranges for 3 decades. The equipment problems create random patterns, not geometric precision. What Miss Lawson accomplished this morning required considerable skill, whether she was hitting or missing." The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, filled with unspoken questions and inadequate answers. Evelyn maintained her composed facade, but subtle signs of stress were beginning to show. A slight tightening around her eyes, a carefully controlled breathing pattern that spoke of someone managing their physiological responses. "Miss Lawson," Blackstone said finally, "is there anything about your background that you think we should know? Any additional qualifications or experience that might explain the skills you've demonstrated?" For a moment, Evelyn's composure wavered. The question was fair, and the evidence was mounting in ways that made continued deception increasingly difficult. Around her, the weight of official scrutiny pressed down like a physical force. She began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "I don't think there's anything relevant to my current position." The response was technically accurate while being fundamentally misleading, and everyone in the room recognized it as such. Blackstone made another note on her tablet, her expression suggesting the interview was drawing to a close. "Very well," Blackstone said. "For now, you'll continue with your assigned duties while we complete our standard verification procedures. Master Chief Kane will be conducting additional assessments to ensure you're receiving appropriate training for your skill level." The dismissal was polite but firm, carrying the implicit message that Evelyn's activities would be subject to increased scrutiny. As she rose to leave, Kane's voice stopped her at the door. "Miss Lawson," he said quietly, "a word of advice. In my experience, the truth has a way of coming out eventually. It's usually easier when it comes out on your own terms." Evelyn paused in the doorway, her back to the room, her shoulders tense with the weight of secrets she couldn't share. "I'll keep that in mind, Master Chief." As the door closed behind her, Blackstone and Kane exchanged glances heavy with shared understanding. Whatever Evelyn Lawson's true story might be, it was clear that the version they'd been given was incomplete at best. "What's your assessment?" Blackstone asked. Kane moved to the window, watching Evelyn's figure disappear into the evening shadows. 32 years of experience says she's military, former military with advanced training in multiple specialties. The question is why she's hiding it. And the answer to that question? Could be anything, Kane admitted. Career change, personal reasons, or something more complicated. But people don't develop those skills in civilian first aid courses and gaming sessions. She's had professional training. Probably extensive professional training. Blackstone nodded, her decision already made. I want that background investigation expedited. Full military personnel records, not just the standard civilian databases. If she's former military, I want to know which branch, what specialty, and why she's here under civilian credentials. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Come in, Blackstone called. Lieutenant Pierce entered, his expression urgent. Ma'am, sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation developing in the simulation center. One of the training scenarios has gone wrong, and we need all available personnel. What kind of situation? Kane asked, immediately alert. Equipment malfunctioned during a close-quarters combat exercise, Pierce explained. Live rounds got mixed with blanks in one of the weapons. We've got injured personnel and a potential active shooter situation until we can account for all ammunition. Blackstone was already reaching for her radio. How many casualties? At least 3 confirmed wounded, possibly more. The exercise is taking place in the confined spaces of Building 12, which limits our response options. We need tactical medics and anyone with experience in hostage rescue scenarios. Kane was moving toward the door before Pierce finished speaking. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to coordinate the response from the scene. Granted, Blackstone said. Take whoever you need. As they prepared to leave, Pierce hesitated. Ma'am, there's one more thing. Miss Lawson was in the building when the incident occurred. Last radio contact placed her in the communications center on the 2nd floor. The information hit Kane like a physical blow. In a building with live rounds and panicked personnel, a civilian contractor would be more liability than asset. Unless, of course, that civilian contractor wasn't actually civilian. Time to find out what Miss Lawson is really made of, Kane muttered as they rushed toward the simulation center. Building 12 rose from the training complex like a concrete monument to military preparedness. 4 stories of reinforced construction, designed to withstand explosions and small arms fire, while providing realistic training environments for urban combat scenarios. Tonight, those same features that made it excellent for training made it a nightmare for emergency response. Kane's radio crackled with updates as they approached the building. Control, this is Team 1. We've established a perimeter around Building 12. No movement visible from the outside, but we're picking up radio chatter that suggests multiple personnel are still inside and unaccounted for. How many people were in the building when this started? Kane asked Pierce as they took cover behind a concrete barrier 50 yards from the main entrance. Pierce consulted his tablet, scrolling through the evening's training roster. 23 trainees, 4 instructors, and 3 civilian contractors including Miss Lawson. Total of 30 souls. Kane did the math quickly. 3 confirmed wounded meant at least 27 people still inside, possibly including whoever had introduced live ammunition into what should have been a controlled exercise. The tactical problem was complex. They needed to extract injured personnel while ensuring that no additional harm came to those still inside. What's the layout of the communications center where Lawson was last located? Kane asked. 2nd floor, northeast corner, Pierce replied, pulling up building schematics on his tablet. 2 entrances. Primary access through the main corridor. Secondary access through an emergency stairwell. Windows face the parking area, reinforced glass designed to stop rifle rounds. Through his binoculars, Kane studied the 2nd floor windows. Most were dark, but the communication center showed faint light that could indicate either normal operation or emergency lighting. No movement was visible from their position. Kane's radio squawked with an incoming transmission. Control, this is Team 2. We've got visual contact with personnel on the 1st floor. They appear to be taking cover in the main training area. No signs of immediate threat, but they're clearly in distress. Any sign of our missing civilian contractor? Kane asked. Negative on visual confirmation, but we're picking up radio traffic on the emergency frequency that sounds like someone's coordinating evacuation procedures. Female voice, very calm, very professional. Kane and Pierce exchanged glances. In a crisis situation, most civilian contractors would be focused on their own survival, not coordinating rescue operations. Unless they weren't actually civilian contractors. "Control, this is Overwatch," came another voice over the radio. "I've got movement in the second-floor communication center. Single individual, appears to be female, moving between radio equipment. Wait." A pause that stretched uncomfortably long. "Holy cow. She's treating wounded personnel. I count at least 2 casualties in that room. And she's applying what looks like professional medical care." Kane grabbed his radio. "Overwatch, this is Control. Can you describe the medical procedures you're observing?" "Affirmative, Control. She's got 1 casualty with what appears to be a chest wound. She's applied an occlusive dressing and is monitoring respiratory function. Second casualty looks like a leg wound, and she's applied a tourniquet above the injury site. Both treatments appear textbook correct." Pierce looked at Kane with an expression that mixed amazement with growing understanding. "Master Chief, civilian contractors don't typically carry occlusive dressings and tourniquets." "No," Kane agreed grimly, "they don't." The tactical situation was evolving rapidly. Through coordinated team movements, they'd identified the source of the live ammunition, a training malfunction that had introduced real rounds into what should have been a blank-fire exercise. The immediate threat was contained, but they still had injured personnel scattered throughout the building who needed medical attention. "Control, this is Team 3, came a new voice over the radio. "We've reached the first-floor casualties. 2 wounded, both stable, but they're requesting immediate evacuation to medical facilities. They also report that someone in the communications center has been coordinating their care via radio, providing medical guidance that's kept them alive." Kane was beginning to understand what they were dealing with. The mysterious civilian contractor who couldn't hit targets during qualification was apparently running triage and medical coordination for a building full of injured personnel. The same woman who claimed her medical knowledge came from community college courses was applying trauma care techniques that took years of training to master. Evelyn reviewed the advanced certification program, Military Sniper to Civilian Security Pathway. 18 months transforms combat expertise into high-paying professional careers. 87% placement rate with starting salaries exceeding 6 figures. This specialized certification program converts elite warriors into sought-after professionals in corporate security and federal law enforcement roles. "We need to get into that communication center," Kane decided. "If she's got wounded personnel up there, they need proper medical evacuation." The entry team moved with practiced precision, clearing each floor methodically while maintaining radio contact with the communication center. As they approached the second-floor corridor, Kane could hear voices through the reinforced door. One male voice weak with pain, one female voice steady and calm, providing reassurance and medical instruction. Kane knocked sharply on the door. "Miss Lawson, this is Master Chief Kane. We're here to provide assistance." The door opened immediately, revealing Evelyn Lawson in a way that no one at the facility had seen her before. Her civilian clothes were stained with blood, her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her gray-blue eyes held the focused intensity of someone who'd been making life-and-death decisions for the past hour. Behind her, 2 wounded trainees lay on improvised gurneys made from communication equipment and emergency blankets. Both had been treated with professional competence that would have impressed combat medics with years of experience. "Master Chief," Evelyn said, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty she'd shown throughout the day, "I've got 2 casualties requiring immediate evacuation. Trainee Morrison has a through-and-through gunshot wound to the upper chest. No vital organ involvement, but he's lost significant blood. Trainee Hayes has a compound fracture of the left tibia, with moderate bleeding that's been controlled." Kane stepped into the room, taking in the scene with professional assessment. Medical supplies that should have taken trained personnel minutes to locate had been organized with military efficiency. Radio equipment had been configured to maintain contact with rescue teams while monitoring medical communications. Everything spoke of someone who'd dealt with casualty situations before. "Miss Lawson, Kane said quietly. Where did you learn to set up a combat aid station? For the first time all day, Evelyn's composure cracked completely. The weight of maintaining her cover while people's lives hung in the balance had finally overwhelmed her ability to maintain the deception. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and when she looked at Kane, he saw exhaustion and resignation in her eyes. She began, then stopped, looking at the wounded trainees who were depending on her care. Morrison was conscious but pale, his breathing shallow but steady. Hayes was drifting in and out of consciousness, her leg immobilized in a field splint that showed textbook-perfect technique. Master Chief, Evelyn said finally, can we evacuate the casualties first? Then I'll answer any questions you have. Kane nodded, understanding that whatever secrets Evelyn was hiding, her priority remained the welfare of the people under her care. Team 2, this is Control. We need immediate medical evacuation for 2 casualties, second-floor communication center. Prepare for urgent transport. As the medical team prepared the wounded for evacuation, Kane observed Evelyn's interactions with the injured trainees. Her touch was gentle but confident, her voice steady and reassuring. When Morrison grabbed her hand as the stretcher team arrived, she squeezed back with the kind of comfort that came from someone who'd held the hands of dying soldiers. You saved my life, Morrison whispered, his earlier hostility completely forgotten. I'm sorry about this morning. I'm sorry about everything. Don't worry about it, Evelyn replied softly. Just focus on getting better. Hayes was semi-conscious but managed to focus on Evelyn's face as she was prepared for transport. You're not really civilian, are you? She mumbled through the haze of pain medication. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then leaned down to speak directly into Hayes's ear. Get some rest, Lisa. Everything's going to be okay. As the medical teams departed with their patients, Kane found himself alone with Evelyn in the communication center. Emergency lighting cast stark shadows across the room, highlighting the organized chaos of medical supplies and communication equipment that told the story of the past hour. Miss Lawson, Kane said quietly, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. Evelyn nodded, suddenly looking older than her apparent years. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the crisis was wearing off, leaving behind the bone-deep fatigue that came with making decisions that meant the difference between life and death. I suppose it is, she agreed. Kane gestured toward the window that looked out over the training complex. You know, in 32 years of military service, I've seen a lot of people under pressure. Most fold when lives are on the line. Some rise to the occasion. Very few perform like they've been there before. Maybe I just handle emergencies well, Evelyn said, but there was no conviction left in the old explanation. Maybe, Kane agreed. Or maybe you're someone who's been in emergencies like this before. Maybe you're someone who's had to set up aid stations under fire, who's had to make triage decisions when there weren't enough medics to go around, who's had to hold the hands of dying soldiers while calling in casualty reports. The accuracy of his description hit Evelyn like a physical blow. For a moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped completely, and Kane saw something in her eyes that he recognized from his own mirror. The weight of command decisions that haunted long after the shooting stopped. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I can't talk about that. Can't or won't? Kane asked gently. Can't, Evelyn repeated, and Kane heard the pain in her voice that spoke of secrets protected by more than personal choice. There are some stories that aren't mine to tell. Kane nodded understanding. In his experience, the people who said they couldn't talk about their service usually had the most important stories to tell, and the best reasons for keeping them secret. Miss Lawson, Kane said formally, as of this moment, you're relieved of all civilian contractor duties. Report to Commander Blackstone's office at 0800 tomorrow morning for reassignment. Evelyn looked up sharply, fear flickering across her features. Reassignment? To the advanced training cadre, Kane clarified. We can use someone with your medical expertise and crisis management skills. Your shooting problems can be addressed with additional training, but what you showed here tonight, that's not something we can teach. Relief flooded Evelyn's features, followed quickly by confusion. You're not going to investigate further? Press for answers about my background? Kane was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the attention of someone making an important decision. "Miss Lawson, in my experience, some warriors earn their place through what they've done. Others earn it through what they choose not to do. Tonight, you chose to save lives instead of protecting your cover story. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." He paused at the door, looking back at the woman who had managed to maintain her secrets while saving 2 lives and coordinating rescue operations for an entire building. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll start working on your accuracy problems." As Kane left the communication center, Evelyn sank into one of the radio operator chairs, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what had just happened. Her cover hadn't been blown, but it had certainly been bent to the breaking point. Kane's offer of reassignment felt like a lifeline, but it also represented another complication in an already complex situation. Outside the windows, the base was returning to normal operations. Emergency vehicles were departing, lights and sirens fading into the distance. The crisis was over, but Evelyn knew that her time as an anonymous civilian contractor had ended with Morrison's blood on her hands, and Hayes's life hanging in the balance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities for the truth to surface. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of honest reflection on the day that had changed everything. The morning's humiliation in the mess hall seemed like it had happened to a different person. The woman who had deliberately missed targets to hide her capabilities felt like a stranger. In the space of a few hours, she'd been forced to reveal skills that she'd spent months learning to conceal. But as she looked at the blood-stained equipment and improvised medical supplies that had saved 2 lives, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. A sense that she was where she belonged, doing work that mattered. The skull tattoo hidden beneath her shirt seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, a reminder of operations that couldn't be discussed, and missions that officially never happened. But tonight, for the first time since arriving at the facility, the weight of those secrets felt bearable. Captain Elena Raven Lawson, 512 confirmed kills, Phantom Ridge Recon Unit, officially killed in action, Helmand Province 2017, had spent the day learning that some truths couldn't stay buried forever. But Evelyn Lawson, civilian contractor with mysterious medical skills and unusual shooting patterns, had also learned that sometimes the truth found ways to serve without being spoken. As the emergency lighting dimmed and normal illumination returned to the communication center, Evelyn began the careful work of destroying evidence of capabilities she couldn't afford to officially possess. Medical supplies were repacked, radio equipment was reset to standard configurations, and the organized efficiency that had saved lives was carefully disguised as the kind of chaos that any civilian might create during a crisis. By the time security personnel arrived to secure the scene, they found nothing more than what they expected: a shaken civilian contractor who had done her best to help in an emergency situation. The professional medical care that had kept 2 people alive would be attributed to good instincts and basic first aid training. The coordination of rescue operations would be credited to luck and clear thinking under pressure. But Master Chief Kane knew better, and tomorrow morning at 0800, Evelyn Lawson would begin the next phase of a game that was far from over. The truth about Phantom Ridge would remain classified. The story of Captain Elena Raven Lawson would stay buried in files that civilian contractors weren't supposed to know existed. But the skills that had kept her alive through operations in places that didn't officially have American personnel, those skills had found a new purpose. And in the morning, when the base awakened to stories of heroism and quick thinking that had prevented tragedy, no one would suspect that the quiet woman with blue hair had once been the most feared sniper in the most classified unit in American military history. The game was far from over, but the rules had changed in ways that no one could have predicted when the day began with scattered eggs and cruel laughter in a military mess hall. Some secrets, Evelyn reflected as she prepared to leave the communication center, were worth keeping. Others were worth protecting through careful revelation, and a very few were worth dying for. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of lives saved and missions accomplished, she understood that the most important secrets were the ones that found ways to serve even when they couldn't be spoken. The transformation from Evelyn Lawson, mysterious civilian contractor, to someone who belonged in the world of military professionals, had taken exactly one crisis. But the price of that transformation was the constant vigilance required to ensure that her deepest secrets remained exactly that, secret. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve without revealing the full truth. But tonight had proven that even the most carefully constructed identities could bend without breaking when lives hung in the balance. As she walked through the corridors of Building 12, past the scenes where emergency responders had worked to save lives and secure the scene, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The day that had begun with humiliation and mockery had ended with respect earned through actions rather than words. But the most important victory wasn't the recognition she'd gained. It was the knowledge that she could still serve, still make a difference, still be the person she'd trained to become even while hiding the proof of who she'd been. The skull tattoo beneath her shirt told stories of operations that would never be acknowledged, missions that officially never happened, and sacrifices that would never be publicly honored. But tonight, those same skills and instincts had found a new purpose that didn't require official recognition or public acknowledgement. Sometimes, Evelyn reflected as she finally made her way back to her temporary quarters, the greatest victories were the ones that no one ever heard about. And sometimes, the most important service was rendered by people who couldn't afford to take credit for their actions. The game that had begun with scattered breakfast and cruel laughter had evolved into something far more complex and meaningful. But the woman who would wake up tomorrow morning as Evelyn Lawson, advanced training cadre, was still protecting secrets that could change everything if they ever came to light. The truth about Captain Elena Raven Lawson would remain classified, but the legend of what that truth represented, skill, sacrifice, and silent service, had found a new way to continue. The morning after the Simulation Center crisis brought an atmosphere of barely contained tension to the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. Word of the previous night's events had spread through official and unofficial channels, creating a buzz of speculation that followed Evelyn wherever she went. Her reassignment to the advanced training cadre had been announced at the dawn briefing, but the questions in people's eyes suggested that her civilian contractor days were officially over. Kane found her in the equipment maintenance bay at 0600, methodically cleaning the old M40A3 that had started everything. Her movements were precise, almost meditative, as she worked gun oil into the worn wooden stock with the kind of attention that spoke of deep familiarity with the weapon. "Miss Lawson," Kane said, his tone carrying the weight of official business, "Commander Blackstone wants to see you conduct a full shooting assessment this morning. Range time at 0800. Evelyn looked up from her work, understanding immediately that this wasn't a request. "What kind of assessment?" "The kind that settles questions," Kane replied cryptically. "The kind where there's no room for scope problems or equipment malfunctions. The kind where we find out what you're really capable of." The implications hung heavy in the morning air. After the previous night's demonstration of medical and tactical skills that couldn't be explained by civilian training, the facility's leadership had clearly decided that Evelyn's shooting problems needed to be resolved one way or another. "Understood, Master Chief," Evelyn said quietly, returning her attention to the rifle. "I'll be ready." As Kane departed, Evelyn continued her maintenance routine while wrestling with the knowledge that her carefully constructed performance was about to face its ultimate test. The time for mathematical precision in missing had passed. Whatever happened on the range this morning would determine whether her cover could survive, or whether the truth about Captain Elena Raven Lawson would finally surface. The walk to the range took her past groups of trainees who fell silent as she passed, their earlier mockery replaced by curious respect, tinged with suspicion. The woman who'd been dismissed as cosplay Barbie 24 hours earlier was now the subject of intense speculation about hidden capabilities that didn't match her official identity. Morrison's absence was notably felt. He was still in the base medical facility recovering from his gunshot wound, but Hayes had been cleared for light duty and was among the gathered observers, her left leg immobilized in a walking cast that served as a visible reminder of the previous night's events. The range setup was different this morning. Instead of the standard 200-yard familiarization course, targets had been placed at intervals stretching out to 800 yards. Wind flags fluttered along the range, indicating a steady 15-mile-per-hour crosswind that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Commander Blackstone stood in the observation area, her presence adding an official weight to the proceedings that made it clear this wasn't routine training. Beside her, several senior staff members had gathered to witness what everyone understood would be a definitive moment in the mystery of Evelyn Lawson. "Lane 7, Pierce announced through the range speakers, his voice carrying across the concrete with mechanical precision. "You're cleared for advanced assessment. Targets at 400, 600, and 800 yards. Wind conditions, 15 miles per hour from the northeast. 10 rounds total. Begin when ready." Evelyn approached the firing line with the same deliberate calm she'd shown throughout her time at the facility. But those watching closely noticed subtle differences in her movements. A slightly different stance, a more natural grip on the rifle, breathing patterns that suggested someone settling into familiar territory. The first shot came after a longer than usual preparation period. Evelyn had spent nearly 2 minutes studying wind conditions, checking her equipment, and settling into a shooting position that looked somehow more professional than her previous demonstrations. The crack of the rifle echoed across the range, sharp and clean in the morning air. Through the spotting scopes, observers watched the bullet impact dead center on the 400-yard target, a perfect bullseye that drew surprised murmurs from the gathered crowd. "Scope adjustment," Evelyn called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "Testing new settings." But Kane wasn't buying the explanation this time. He'd seen enough shooting in his career to recognize the difference between lucky shots and deliberate precision. The woman behind that rifle was demonstrating capabilities that went far beyond equipment adjustments. The second shot followed 30 seconds later, striking the 600-yard target with the same devastating accuracy. Dead center. No hesitation, no correction needed. The kind of shot that professional snipers practiced for years to achieve consistently. A hush fell over the observation area as the implications became clear. The woman who'd missed every shot 2 days earlier was now placing bullets exactly where she intended them to go, under conditions that would challenge military marksmen with years of experience. The third shot targeted the 800-yard mark, the distance where wind conditions and bullet drop created complex calculations that separated skilled shooters from exceptional ones. Evelyn took her time, studying conditions with the methodical attention of someone who understood the variables involved. When the shot came, it was followed by a silence that stretched uncomfortably long. Through his scope, Pierce could see the target clearly. Another perfect center hit that defied explanation under the existing narrative of civilian contractor with accuracy problems. "Control, this is observation," came a voice over the radio. "Can you confirm that target hit? Looks like dead center from here." "Confirmed," Pierce replied, his voice tight with concentration. "Dead center at 800 yards and 15-mile-per-hour crosswind." The gathered observers exchanged glances heavy with implications that no one wanted to voice aloud. The shooting they were witnessing wasn't consistent with equipment problems, lucky accidents, or civilian training courses. It was the kind of precision that took years of professional development to achieve. Evelyn continued her demonstration with methodical efficiency, placing 7 more rounds with devastating accuracy across all 3 target distances. Each shot was perfect, each placement exactly where the laws of ballistics dictated it should be under the prevailing conditions. But it was the manner of her shooting that caught the attention of the experienced military personnel watching. The breathing patterns, the trigger control, the way she worked the bolt action between shots. Everything spoke of someone who'd spent countless hours behind a rifle, under conditions where missing meant more than failing a training exercise. As she fired her final round, another perfect bullseye at 800 yards, a gust of wind caught her shirt, pulling the deep V-neck fabric away from her chest. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, the black skull tattoo was fully visible to everyone in the observation area. The tattoo was larger than the glimpse had suggested, covering most of her upper chest with intricate detail that spoke of professional artistry. The skull's eye sockets seemed to stare out with hollow intensity, while the white scar that sliced through the left side added an element of violence to the imagery. But it was the smaller details that made Kane's blood run cold. The crossed rifles behind the skull, the dates inscribed in small script, the unit designation that he recognized from classified briefings. "Holy cow," Kane whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the range. Evelyn realized what had happened immediately, her hand moving instinctively to adjust her shirt. But it was too late. The image of the tattoo had been burned into the retinas of everyone present, and the implications were spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Hayes spoke first, her voice shaking with recognition and disbelief. That's a Phantom Ridge tattoo." The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Phantom Ridge was a name whispered in classified briefings, referenced in redacted after-action reports, mentioned only by senior staff who'd been briefed on operations that officially didn't exist. It wasn't a unit that civilian contractors would know about, much less have tattooed on their bodies. Kane stepped forward, his weathered face pale with understanding. "Miss Lawson," he said formally, his voice carrying across the range with command authority. "Step away from the firing line." But Evelyn didn't move. She stood behind the rifle, her gray-blue eyes meeting his gaze with a steady calm that spoke of someone who'd always known this moment would come. Around them, the tension ratcheted higher as the full implications of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. "Miss Lawson," Kane repeated, his tone harder now. "Step away from the weapon. Now." "I don't think so, Master Chief," came a new voice from behind the observation area. "I think she should stay exactly where she is." Everyone turned toward the voice, weapons appearing in hands with the speed that came from years of training. But the figure approaching the range wore the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his stride confident, despite the dozen weapons now tracking his movement. The man was tall, lean, with the kind of weathered features that spoke of years spent in harsh climates under difficult conditions. His civilian clothes couldn't disguise the military bearing that marked him as clearly as a uniform, and his eyes held the same distant focus that Kane recognized in his own mirror. "Marcus Rivera," Kane said, recognition dawning. "You're supposed to be dead." Rivera smiled, the expression containing no warmth. "So is she. But here we are, having a reunion on a Navy range in front of people who aren't cleared to know we exist." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. Rivera, Ghost Rivera from the classified briefings, the Phantom Ridge operative who'd been declared killed in action during the same operation that had claimed Evelyn's official life. If he was here, if he was alive, then everything about the past few days took on a completely different meaning. "Hello, Raven," Rivera said, his attention turning to Evelyn with an intensity that made everyone else on the range step back involuntarily. "Miss me?" Evelyn's response was to shift her position slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood tactical positioning. The rifle that had been pointed down range was now angled in a direction that could cover multiple positions, including Rivera's approach route. "Ghost," she acknowledged, her voice carrying none of the uncertainty she'd shown throughout her time at the facility. "You always did have a flair for dramatic timing." "Had to make sure you were really back," Rivera replied, his own positioning suggesting someone prepared for violence despite the public setting. "Had to make sure it was really you, and not some elaborate operation to flush out survivors." Kane found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "Someone want to explain what the hell is happening here?" Rivera's attention shifted to Kane, his expression suggesting someone evaluating potential threats. "What's happening, Master Chief, is that you've been hosting a ghost. Captain Elena Raven Lawson, Phantom Ridge Recon Unit, 512 confirmed kills. Officially killed in action Helmand Province, 2017. The statistics hit the assembled group like successive blows from a sledgehammer. 512 confirmed kills was a number that belonged in history books, not attached to the quiet woman with blue hair who'd been dismissed as a wannabe sniper just days earlier. "That's impossible," Hayes said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She can't hit anything. We saw her miss every shot." "Did you?" Rivera asked, his tone suggesting someone who found the entire situation amusing. "Or did you see exactly what she wanted you to see?" Raven always was the best at controlled demonstrations. Commander Blackstone stepped forward, her command presence asserting itself, despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Mr. Rivera, you're on a military installation without authorization. Whatever your history with Miss Lawson, this matter will be handled through proper channels." Rivera's laughter was sharp and bitter. "Proper channels? Commander, there are no proper channels for people like us. We exist in the spaces between proper channels, in the gaps where official policy meets operational necessity." He gestured toward Evelyn, who remained motionless behind her rifle. "She came here for a reason, not to hide, not to retire, but to accomplish something. The question is whether you're going to help her, or whether I'm going to have to extract her from another failed operation. If that file revelation just shocked you to your core, subscribe immediately, because the biggest surprise is still coming. Our channel exposes hidden military heroes whose stories deserve to be told. Ring the bell to witness the full truth about Phantom Ridge." The standoff stretched uncomfortably long, weapons trained in multiple directions, tensions escalating toward a breaking point that could only end badly for everyone involved. But it was Evelyn who broke the silence, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. "Stand down," she said, though it wasn't clear who she was addressing. "All of you, stand down." She slowly lifted her hands away from the rifle, her movements deliberate and unthreatening. But even disarmed, her presence on the range had transformed from that of a confused civilian contractor to something altogether more dangerous. "My name is Elena Lawson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the range. "I am not now, nor have I ever been, a civilian contractor. I am a captain in the United States Army, assigned to classified operations under Phantom Ridge authorization." The admission hit the assembled group like a physical force. After days of speculation and growing suspicion, the truth was finally being spoken aloud in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. "I came to this facility," Evelyn continued, "because we had intelligence suggesting that classified operational techniques were being leaked through training programs. Someone with access to Phantom Ridge methodologies was selling information to hostile actors." Kane stepped closer, his expression grim with understanding. "You were investigating us." "I was investigating everyone," Evelyn corrected. "Every instructor, every trainee, every civilian contractor, every support staff member who had access to advanced training protocols. The leak could have come from anywhere." Rivera nodded approval. Classic Raven. Hide in plain sight. Let the targets reveal themselves through their own actions. Then document everything for prosecution. Blackstone's face had gone pale as the implications sank in. "The shooting demonstration, the medical response, everything you've done here, was designed to test reactions and capabilities," Evelyn confirmed. "To see who recognized techniques they shouldn't know, who asked questions they shouldn't ask, who had access to information they shouldn't possess." The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened over the past few days. The deliberate missing that had drawn attention, the medical competence that had raised questions, even the crisis response that had revealed her true capabilities. All of it had been orchestrated to flush out security breaches in the training program. "So who's the leak?" Kane asked, though something in his expression suggested he might already know the answer. Evelyn's gaze moved through the assembled group, finally settling on a figure at the edge of the observation area who'd been trying to blend into the background since Rivera's arrival. Administrative Officer Captain Williams stood frozen, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. "Captain Williams," Evelyn said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone on the range turn to stare at the accused man. "Would you care to explain why you've been accessing Phantom Ridge training files for the past 8 months? Williams tried to run. It was an instinctive response born of desperation and panic, but he made it less than 10 yards before Rivera's tackle brought him down hard on the concrete. The impact drove the air from Williams' lungs in a whoosh that echoed across the range. "Marcus Rivera," Rivera announced formally as he secured Williams with zip ties that seemed to appear from nowhere. "Phantom Ridge Recovery Specialist. Captain Williams, you're under arrest for violation of the Espionage Act, unauthorized access to classified materials, and conspiracy to provide aid and comfort to enemies of the United States. The arrest happened with the smooth efficiency of people who'd done it before. Williams's protests and denials were ignored, as Rivera conducted a professional search that produced several electronic devices, encrypted storage media, and documentation that clearly didn't belong in the possession of an administrative officer. Kane watched the proceedings with the fascination of someone witnessing the conclusion of a mystery he'd been trying to solve. "How long have you known? About Williams specifically?" 3 days, Evelyn replied, finally stepping away from the rifle that had started everything. "About the leak in general? We've been tracking information flows for 6 months. Williams was selling training methodologies to private military contractors who were using them to train foreign nationals." Blackstone appeared at Kane's shoulder, her expression mixing relief with embarrassment. "The background investigation we ordered would never have found anything," Rivera confirmed. "Raven's credentials are perfect because they're real. She is exactly what her paperwork says she is, a military officer assigned to classified operations. The civilian contractor story was operational cover. As Williams was led away by military police who'd appeared with impressive speed, the crowd of observers began to disperse. The mystery of Evelyn Lawson had been solved, but the solution raised as many questions as it answered. Hayes approached Evelyn hesitantly, her expression mixing gratitude with awe. "You saved my life last night, even though it meant risking your cover." "Lives always come first," Evelyn replied simply. "That's not negotiable." "Will you stay?" Hayes asked. "Will you continue training here?" Evelyn looked around the range where her carefully constructed cover had finally been stripped away. The old M40A3 still sat on the firing line, its worn wood and scratched metal telling stories of countless training exercises. But the woman who'd chosen that rifle to hide her capabilities was gone, replaced by someone whose true identity carried responsibilities that civilian contractors didn't face. Evelyn reviewed the Advanced Certification Program, Military Sniper to Civilian Security Pathway. 18 months transforms combat expertise into high-paying professional careers. 87% placement rate with starting salaries exceeding 6 figures. This specialized certification program converts elite warriors into sought-after professionals in corporate security and federal law enforcement roles. "That depends," Evelyn said finally, "on what comes next." Rivera approached, his expression serious despite the successful conclusion of their operation. "Command wants to see you. Both of us. There's been developments." "What kind of developments?" Evelyn asked, though something in Rivera's tone suggested she might not want to know the answer. "The kind that require Phantom Ridge to come out of retirement," Rivera replied grimly. "The kind that mean our official deaths might have been premature." Kane stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "Miss Lawson, Captain Lawson, whatever you decide about the future, you've earned your place here. What you accomplished in the past few days, what you did last night, that's the kind of service that makes a difference." Evelyn nodded acknowledgement, but her attention was focused on Rivera and the implications of his presence. Phantom Ridge had been disbanded after the Helmand operation, its members officially killed in action to protect the classified nature of their work. If Command was considering reactivation, it meant threats had emerged that required capabilities that didn't officially exist. "How many others?" she asked Rivera quietly. 7 confirmed survivors," Rivera replied. 3 more possibles who haven't been located yet. Command wants to brief the team on emerging threats that require our particular skill set." The conversation was taking place in front of an audience that wasn't cleared to hear such discussions. But the operational necessities outweighed security concerns. Williams' arrest had blown operational covers that could never be reconstructed, making concealment pointless. Feeling that satisfaction of justice served cold? Subscribe for more stories where quiet competence destroys loud ignorance. We showcase real military vindication every week. The bell guarantees you'll never miss another underdog triumph that'll leave you cheering. "Master Chief," Evelyn said, turning back the cane with an expression that mixed regret with determination. "Thank you for your patience with my deception. Under different circumstances, I would have been honored to serve under your instruction." Kane extended his hand, the gesture carrying the respect of one professional for another. "Captain Lawson, It's been an honor to witness your work. Whatever comes next, you carry yourself like a warrior." The handshake lasted longer than protocol required, both participants understanding that they were saying goodbye to possibilities that circumstances wouldn't allow to develop. Kane had offered Evelyn a place in the training cadre, but larger forces were already pulling her toward responsibilities that training instructors didn't face. Blackstone approached as Rivera finished loading Williams into a security vehicle that had materialized with the same efficiency that seemed to characterize all Phantom Ridge operations. "Captain Lawson," Blackstone said formally, "will there be charges related to your deception during this investigation?" "No charges," Rivera answered before Evelyn could respond. "Operational necessity covered all actions taken during this assignment. Captain Lawson was acting under lawful orders from authorized commanders." "And the future?" Blackstone asked. "Will we see either of you again?" Evelyn looked around the facility that had been her home for the past few days, taking in the ranges where she'd hidden her capabilities, the buildings where she'd saved lives, the people who'd come to know her as someone she wasn't, but had learned to respect for who she might be. "Commander," she said finally, "people like us don't really retire. We just find new ways to serve." Rivera gestured toward a black SUV that had appeared at the range entrance, its windows tinted, and its license plates carrying the kind of official markings that discouraged questions. "Time to go, Raven. Command doesn't like to be kept waiting." As they walked toward the vehicle, Hayes called out from behind them. "Captain, what you said about quiet competence, will you remember that?" Evelyn paused at the SUV's door, looking back at the assembled group that represented everything she'd learned to value about military service. Professional competence, mutual respect, willingness to sacrifice for others, all the qualities that had drawn her to special operations in the first place. "Silent competence always defeats loud ignorance," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the range. "Remember that when people try to judge you by appearances instead of actions. Remember that when the world gets loud and cruel. Remember that the people worth respecting are usually the ones who don't demand it." The words had the weight of someone who'd learned their truth through experience that couldn't be shared, but whose lessons could be passed on. Around the range, faces nodded understanding, recognizing wisdom that came from sources they'd never fully comprehend. Rivera started the engine as Evelyn settled into the passenger seat, the vehicle's powerful motor rumbling with the kind of authority that suggested it was designed for more than transportation. Through the windows, the training facility that had been her world for the past few days receded into memory. "Debriefing first," Rivera said as they pulled onto the highway. "Then team briefing. Then we find out whether Phantom Ridge still has work to do in a world that officially forgot we existed." "Any hints about the mission?" Evelyn asked, settling back into the familiar rhythm of operational planning. "Remember the intelligence networks we disrupted in Syria?" Rivera replied grimly. "Turns out we didn't disrupt them as thoroughly as we thought. They've regrouped, evolved, adapted. And they've got capabilities now that require our particular expertise to counter." The implications settled over Evelyn like a familiar weight. Phantom Ridge had been created to handle operations that conventional forces couldn't touch, missions that required capabilities that didn't officially exist. If Command was considering reactivation, it meant enemies had emerged that required the same shadowy response. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Briefings in 6 hours," Rivera replied. "Mission launch in 72 hours if the team accepts activation." The timeline was tight, but Evelyn had learned to function within the compressed schedules that characterized special operations. 3 days to transition from Evelyn Lawson, civilian contractor, to Captain Elena Raven Lawson, Phantom Ridge sniper, back to active duty in operations that would never be acknowledged. "Any regrets about the facility?" Rivera asked, glancing at her as they merged into traffic that would carry them toward responsibilities that civilian life couldn't imagine. Evelyn considered the question carefully. The past few days had shown her possibilities she'd forgotten existed. The satisfaction of teaching, the camaraderie of professional military service, the simple pleasure of being respected for competence rather than feared for capabilities. Some, she admitted. Kane offered me a position with the training cadre. Hayes was beginning to understand what real strength looks like. Even Morrison learned something about judging people by appearances. But, Rivera prompted. But there's work that only we can do, Evelyn finished. And until that work is finished, people like Kane and Hayes and Morrison need people like us to do it. Rivera nodded, understanding. It was the eternal burden of special operations. The knowledge that their sacrifice protected a world that couldn't acknowledge their existence. The people they saved would never know their names. The threats they eliminated would never be publicly recognized, and the prices they paid would never be officially honored. But in a training facility in Coronado, a Master Chief named Kane would remember the civilian contractor who demonstrated that competence came in unexpected packages. A trainee named Hayes would carry forward lessons about strength that didn't announce itself. And even Morrison, recovering from wounds that could have been fatal without Evelyn's intervention, would understand that his survival depended on someone who'd hidden her capabilities until lives hung in the balance. The highway stretched ahead, carrying them toward briefings and missions and responsibilities that would require everything they'd learned during their officially deceased years. But behind them, the Naval Special Warfare Training Center continued its mission of preparing warriors for battles that would test everything they'd been taught. And in the spaces between official policy and operational necessity, the legend of Captain Elena Raven Lawson would continue to serve, not as recognition for past accomplishments, but as inspiration for future generations who would learn that silent competence was the highest form of strength. The skull tattoo hidden beneath her shirt told stories that would never be shared. But the lessons those stories contained had found new ways to teach. In training facilities and operational bases around the world, people would remember that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who looked least threatening. Phantom Ridge was returning to active duty, but its greatest victory might have been accomplished during a few days of deception at a training facility, where a woman with blue hair had taught an entire base that appearances could deceive, competence could hide, and strength often chose silence over swagger. The game that had begun with scattered eggs and cruel laughter had ended with respect earned through actions that mattered. But the war that required Phantom Ridge's unique capabilities was just beginning, and Captain Elena Raven Lawson was ready to serve in shadows that protected a world that would never know her name. The highway carried them toward futures that civilian contractors couldn't imagine. But the past few days had proven that even the most classified operations could find ways to teach lessons that mattered. Silent competence had defeated loud ignorance, and in the end, that victory was worth more than any official recognition. As the training facility disappeared in the rearview mirror, Evelyn allowed herself one final thought about the life she might have lived as an instructor, passing on knowledge to the next generation of warriors. But that thought was quickly replaced by the understanding that some battles required different kinds of teaching, the kind that happened in places where failure meant more than missed grades. Phantom Ridge was back in business, and the world was about to learn why some units were too dangerous to exist officially, but too necessary to disband completely. The lesson of silent competence would live on, but its teachers were returning to work that required capabilities beyond instruction. In the shadows where official policy met operational necessity, legends continued to serve without recognition, and strength revealed itself through actions that would never be acknowledged. The skull tattoo pulsed with its own heartbeat, marking time until the next mission began.